We are going to... Hi, everyone. A very good morning to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very excited for this webinar, and thank you to all the panelists for joining us today. And I'll just take a couple of minutes to set the context and how we are going to flow with this webinar today. We'll start with the launch of IIT Kanpur's report on just transition, wherein they're talking about the situation in Uttar Pradesh and West Bengal. We'll spend a few minutes on the report. We'll request the team to give us, tell us about the major findings of the report, and then we'll follow it up with the discussion. I'll just, before I introduce the panelists, I will just take a minute to explain why we are holding this webinar today. As India steps into the G20 presidency, we are looking at a very exciting year ahead. The G20 members represent more than 80% of the world's GDP, about 75% of the international trade, and more than 60% of the world population. As a strategic group, this group, as a strategic group, it is very crucial how this group looks at energy transition in the year ahead. And energy transition for a country like India has been very crucial and very critical. To hold this webinar, we are looking at how India during the presidency year can look at the whole debate of energy transition, can shape up the narrative, can question or can help different emerging economies. We are going to look at and discuss a lot of these questions in the webinar today. To discuss this and to take this conversation, we have with us Dr. Sandeep Pai, who works with CSIS and has been following on this work on just transition for quite some time now. Very warm welcome to you, Sandeep. We also have with us Swati D'Souza, who works with the International Energy Agency, and she has been following this work and worked on the ground, done studies, and knows quite a bit of international, national, and local context. So she can help us in stitching out this narrative and work and finding how this thing is playing, how just transition is playing out. We also have with us Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi, who has been working on the energy issues of the country with CEW for quite some time now. Very warm welcome to you, Swati and Vaibhav. Thank you so much for joining us. And last but not the least, we have with us Professor Pradeep Sorankar, who is heading the JTRC, Just Transition Research Center with IIT Kanpur, and which has actually emerged in the last couple of years as one of the major knowledge centers as far as just transition is concerned. And his team has been focusing a lot on the social environment issues of the just transition. A very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. To kick off the session, I will request Professor Pradeep to start the session, launch their report, and also invite them to present their findings, major findings of the report. Over to you, Professor Pradeep.
Thank you, Mayank, and thank you. Good morning to everyone who are attending this meeting. It's a pleasure to talk and discuss our work on just transition. But before that, I'd like to thank the distinguished panelists, Dr. Sandeep Pai, Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi, and Swati D'Souza, and the entire team of Climate Trends. Thanks for this opportunity. So before elaborating our work, let me contextualize how this work is important for future just transition. So first, as Mayank mentioned, I would like to start with the topic and today's theme of G20. As primarily G20 is a platform for economic negotiation, and most powerful countries of this world are together to discuss various economic activities. But with this economic activity for the past few years, one important theme is coming up, which is climate change. And with the climate change, mostly right now we are discussing how we can move from one energy system like fossil fuel based energy system to another energy system. Now, our study is more on the grassroots level, perception of the people, and the discussion is more on a very macro level thing. So three important points, like for just transition, we have various actors, and some of the actors are international actors, some of the national actors. For international actors, we have various banks and organizations like kind of a platform, international platforms, and also there are few organizations like ILO, which talks about security and safety of laborers. In the domestic actors, we can see mostly there are government, the ministries, Ministry of Environment, Forest, Ministry of Power, Ministry of Coal, and also some of the business associations apart from the individual businesses like CIA and FICCI. But how this kind of transition will be there. So as a policy scientist, we know that the policy process can have various kind of a way to discuss these things. It can be unilateral. If one actor is taking most of the decision, not very much consulting with others, that can one decision, but it is generally not happening in most of the places. And if we have more than one actor, national, international, within domestic areas, we have some collaborative actions if their understanding and beliefs are same. But sometimes we also have adversarial or contested decision-making process. So when we have that, there are negotiations, and we can see that a lot of negotiations going on in terms of climate and all these things. Discuss also, I think, in this meeting about the fund and just transition fund. But we have to understand that some of the group of the people believe that this fund should be utilized for installation of renewable. Some have debated that this kind of fund, like in the South Africa or Indonesia, whether it's a
Sir,
grant or loan.
Pradeep sir,
Now, yeah.
Pradeep sir, sorry to interject. I was just saying that can we start with the report first, because this is actually
Just
going to be a lot of
report.
our conversation point.
No,
Uh,
I'll just do the report thing. Just give me 1 minute. You have given me 15 minutes, so I'll finish everything in 15 minutes. Don't worry, I never took more time in my given time. So, and uh, why I'm telling this, because when we're talking about this installation of renewable, we are thinking something other aspect. And when we're talking about repurposing coal power plant and all these things, but when we're talking about livelihood, and then we have to talk about the ground, and then how we can combine the bottom up and top down. That's an important question. So with this context, let's start our presentation. We have very few slides. If we have question, we'll discuss more. Let me share our slide. I hope I can share my slides here. Yes. So this is a report from the grassroots, as we mentioned, that West Bengal and Uttar Pradesh, both thermal power plants and coal mines. So we have energy transition for coal-based energy system to renewable energy system, and this is happening, already happening throughout the world and also in India. But we have also an important concept called justice, and then we can see that whether this transition is people-centric or it is not people-centric. To understand this, we took a deep dive into the community and get some understanding and perception of the community. Now, how this process goes, we are conceptualizing things as like, as it's that's why the context, like the individual decision making or multiple decision making or collaborative decision making. So we need to understand who are the stakeholders, and then analyze and context of the various stakeholders have their different types of perception, and but some people have more power to take the decision, and then identify the key factors and issues, and then build some input for the policymakers. So this can be one approach to this just transition later. Now, the report is mainly focused on the stakeholder, and I tried to contextualizing the stakeholder is kind of very loose term, but we have various levels of stakeholder with the different layers of power. So there are workers and trade unions, and there are people, different type of people who are there in the field, but also the companies like coal dependent sectors, railway, steel, cement, brick industry, apart from the power plant and coal mine, and there are government administration. Our report is focused on the level 1, where we are talking about grassroots. So who this question of stakeholder, like actors who have an interest in the issues under considerations. So this is, we have defined that what is a stakeholder and how we can understand various stakeholders. Briefly, very briefly about the method, we have done qualitative interviews, we have done workshops, we have done quantitative interviews, we have undergone various field level observation for a long period of time, And also we have some of the secondary data to have this kind of report. So we have both kind of a mixed method in this report, and the method is very detailed in this report. Primary data collected from the 902 responded between December 2021 to 2022 March, and then we have few structure and close-ended interview, and there are face-to-face interviews. So the primary focus is to understand how people perceive the concept, which is kind of an abstract of just transition. And we have tried to develop a scale to understand the just transition perception scale. And the scale, we have three important components. One is coal downside, like how the coal has a negative impact. And then the question of environment protection, whether we have to think about environment, and whether the community livelihood is also important. So there are number of items, and then we have done all the factor analysis and everything. So I'm not going into detail in this process, but the very primary results. So Riti will describe this.
Actually, this perception scale developed by us, that is the JTRC team, has accommodated three key dimensions, as already told by Professor Swarnekar, that is the coal downside, environment protection, and community livelihood. The coal downside dimension mainly captures the individual's perception on the negative consequences of coal. And environment protection dimension mainly prioritizes the environment over the jobs in coal sector, and also emphasizes on the jobs in the alternate energy sector. And the community livelihood dimension is mainly concerned with the grassroots stakeholders' perception on environment versus jobs, with a main focus on the livelihood thing. So from this perception of just transition scale, what we have found that the individual and the collective perceptions of just transition have a wide range according to the nature of dependence, gender, coal units, and association with the trade unions. The overall perception of just transition regarding these three identified dimensions is stronger among the direct coal dependents, than the indirect ones. The worker's perception is higher for the livelihood dimension from the coal downside. And in another side, the people from power plants exhibited higher perception for coal downside and admitted its negative consequences, and therefore agree with the coal phase down. And we have also considered the trade union membership. So what we found that the trade union associationship has exerted a positive influence to its members for perceiving the environment protection as well as the community livelihood than the non-members of our study coal mines and power plants. So as we have considered the gender as one of our grassroots stakeholders, and one of the grassroots stakeholders of just transition, women in coal sector have stronger perception of coal downside, as they can feel, they have witnessed the negative side of the coal, and they have strongly suggested the need for coal phase down and the alternative energy sources. And the conclusion remarks will be gathered by Dr. Swati.
Okay, so we have one more slides, and two more slides. The most important thing in the next one we have discussed is that people's perception and how that perception can link to the expectation, and then how that overlapping area can be useful for policy intervention. And that's why we are talking about more informed decision making in terms of local level or national level. Briefly, I'm not going to actually elaborate these things, but we have three important components like coal downside, environmental protection, and community livelihood. We fetched information from various types of methods, from the government, from the coal company, and the trade unions. And how in our reports we have showed that and no one showed a consensus on coal phase down, and that's an important point, because we have started discussing this and there is kind of an uncertainty. But community livelihood is an important issue for all the important three stakeholders like government, coal company, and trade union. So we have actually elaborated everything in detail, but If we have question, we can take this, or in this due course of our discussion, we can again discuss this. Thank you very much, Mayank. I think I have not taken more than 15 minutes. Yeah.
No, no, thank you, thank you, Professor. I think we would have loved to listen to more of your results study, but I think that will come during the course of the conversation. Thank you so much. In fact, this actually sets the stage for the discussion that we have today. Uh, Swati, I would like to start with you. When we have been, this is a year from the last few months, we have, in fact, spoken so much and listened and read so much about the JETP deals with Indonesia and South Africa, and how there are murmurs for a similar deal with India. Can we just try and understand, when we are looking at these kind of discussions, can you elaborate on how do you see India maneuvering this space during the next 12 months, especially in the context of when, as Pradeep just mentioned, about the lack of consensus with among so many players? How do you see India maneuvering this local the international one?
Hi, Mayank. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Swarnakar. Thank you, Clementine, for inviting me. Okay. So see, at the heart of it, JETP, to my understanding, is a political declaration. It's a political declaration by the recipient countries that they will phase out unabated coal and accelerate their decarbonization pathway. But this political declaration is complemented by a financial commitment by the donor countries, primarily the G7, in collaboration with different with multilateral development banks, development finance or green finance institutions, and even the private sector. The G20 presidency in Indonesia ended with the announcement of the JETP deal of 20 billion, 10 billion of which comes from the G7 countries, the rest 10 billion which comes from financial institutions, primarily the Glasgow Alliance. In South Africa, ahead of COP, we now have the contours of how the 8.5 billion deal is going to be structured. Only 4% comes in the form of grants, 63% in the form of concessional loans, and the rest in form of commercial loans and guarantees. So with this as a context, on the Indian side, the conversations on JETP have been actually happening for a while, but not necessarily as the intended framework with what we saw in South Africa and in Indonesia. So over here, you have two parallel tracks of conversation happening. First, on the Ministry of Coal side, we've seen announcements over the last year when from the mine closure framework that's being co-developed by the World Bank and the Ministry of Coal, the opening of a just transition division within the Ministry of Coal, having task force within Coal India, states like Jharkhand putting together a just energy transition task force. But at the same time, if you look at multilateral platforms, particularly COP, India's stance on just transition does not explicitly talk about decarbonization of coal assets. The way the Indian power ministry as well as the environment ministry are looking at just transitions is from a broader perspective of low carbon development. Just to quote something that India actually said at COP, that support for just transition means increased support for deployment of renewables, increased support for development of renewable technologies, and means to cope with the cost of such development and deployment of these technologies. So at one level, it may seem like India has a dual perspective on coal transitions and just transitions and the larger JETP agreement. But if you look at how our energy trajectory, the demand trajectory goes, as per the World Energy Outlook in 2022, given India's just sheer scale of development needs, coal demand only peaks by mid 2030s under the stated policy scenario. But if we do end up meeting our 2070 targets and under the announced policy scenario, even then we see coal demand peaking only by late 2020s, which is why we are also seeing a lot of conversation on more power plants, on investment in more power plants as well as coal mines. So given this, how do you juxtapose the idea of a phase out or phase out and the jet P, right? So this is going to be a very tricky space for India, because I think the one thing that India needs everyone to understand is the contours of our jet P cannot be framed as the same way as Indonesia and South Africa, given our energy needs are going to be a slightly different. Our workforce is different from both of this. There is no mention of informal labor in the JETP deals in South Africa or in Indonesia. We know the level and the importance that informal labor plays within the coal economy in India. The other question to ask, and we only have South Africa right now to rely on, is how is the JETP going to be constructed? How are the terms of the agreement going to be constructed? If we have to follow the South African agreement, then only 4% comes under grants. So will India have to take on more debt to phase out some of the economically unviable coal assets, while also investing in new coal assets and putting up a low carbon trajectory and going down the low carbon trajectory? So these are, I think, a couple of moving parts that have happened, and which I think the Indian JETP needs to think about how. And this is, I think, what the different voices in the government have been trying to convey to the G7 countries and other partners, that an Indian JETP cannot be similar to an Indonesian JETP or a South African JETP, because the Indian context differs just from the sheer size of its development needs and the people who are dependent on the coal economy. So I'm going to stop here because I think my 5 minutes is up. We can continue this discussion in later.
Thank you, Swati, for setting this context. And in fact, this helps me take this question to Sandeep, because I remember having this conversation with Sandeep for last 3-4 years, in fact, that when people were not even talking about just transition. So Sandeep, I just want to come to this: just transition, clean energy transition, energy transition. There are so many terms just floating around. Just first part, can we just look at how just transition has evolved in India? Because to move with the just transition partnership, we need to see how this has evolved. And Swati has also touched upon it, that we need to have an Indian context in it. So first part, how it has evolved in India, and then if you can also elaborate a little more, that do you see in this next 1 year India finding or securing a sweet spot? Do you see a kind of deal that will suit India's perspective, India's needs, India's context? Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Mayak, and everybody else. Hello. First of all, I think before I dive into this question, I really need to congratulate Pradeep and his team for this really important report. One of the key tenets of just transition is procedural justice, and it's really important to highlight voices from the ground. So this is one of those reports that kind of does two things. One, it highlights us and unpacks different stakeholders' varied perception on just transition, energy transition, phase down, livelihoods, etc. But also it captures new geography. Most of the research in India, if you don't look at the macro level research, most of the research on just transition that has happened, that has mainly focused on states like Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh, but this is a new territory. So I congratulate Pradeep and his team to do this research in West Bengal and Uttar Pradesh, and looking at both power plants in mind. So I wanted to start with that. But now to your first question about how just transition has evolved. So look, this is unlike other countries. This is a very, very new topic in the Indian context, right? This is a topic maybe a 3 years, maybe 4-year old. It started with some research, some sort of researchers writing some stuff about what just transition is, trying to quantify what is the scale of dependency on just transition, and then other think tanks, independent researchers, academics, and then people in think tank, like researchers in think tank. That was stage one of this just transition process that kind of started 3-4 years ago. And then journalists also writing about some of the research. Some journalists like you, Mayank, who has taken up this topic in a very big way, writing about this. So I call that stage one, researcher focused stage, where there was a lot of research. there was a lot of discussion about renewable jobs versus, thankfully that has died down, but renewable jobs will be in like millions and coal jobs are tiny little, and coal economy is nothing, and you heard a lot of those discussions on Twitter and everywhere. So that was stage one, where people started collecting data and quantifying stuff. And there's been series of good studies on that. So when thankfully we passed that stage, and then we reached stage two, where it was continuing to do research, but also engagement. Now here came all the policymakers that Swati mentioned, right? From Coal Indias of the world, from Ministry of Coals of the world, and states like Jharkhand and other, even at district level in certain districts. And so that was a very important stage where all this research was kind of getting transmitted to the key policymakers, be it unions. I mean, you may call it, like, let's call it stakeholders, key stakeholders. And so that was stage two. And that really, really started 1 year ago. And now we are at really stage three of this just transition process, where this research plus engagement has led to starting of its beginning of institutionalization. So that's when you see all these like just transition task forces. I mean, nobody knows what they will do in the future, but that is how globally institutionalization of just transition has happened. And it's really remarkable that in just 2 or 3 years, you have these large, from world's largest coal mining company to Ministry of Coal to a state like Jharkhand forming task force. Even Chhattisgarh is contemplating forming just transition task force. So a lot has happened, but at the same time, we have to understand that still people don't understand what just transition is. We want to reach a stage where different stakeholders have very strong opinion about just transition. That is how it has evolved globally. If you look at South Africa, if you look at US, like every player has a very, very strong opinion about what a just transition should look like. Indian stakeholders have no opinion, literally, at this stage. And that is partly a function of where we are, because people know that coal is not going anywhere in the next 10, 15, 20 years. So that happens. But that also means that the country is not really ready to kind of understand what do we do with this just transition process. So now let's take this evolution of just transition process and connect it to the JETP, right? So think about South Africa. I mean, they have been debating this stuff from 2009, and then they formed the Presidential Council. This has been a long story. Every player, every key stakeholder has a very, very strong document on what just transition means. Like they have exact projects that, like at least at the stakeholder level, that they want to do as part of just transition. For some, it means complete transformation of the economy, anti-capital, you name it. And for others, it's a very narrow focus, which means like workers' livelihoods. So while in India's case, we have reached a stage where it's become a topic from a non-topic, it's not at a stage where we know what we will do in the next decade. Like we don't know which projects to execute. We don't know who will support those projects, etc. So in that context, I think even if India signs a JETP, it will be very premature and arbitrary. I mean, I'm not saying that India should not, but use this 1 year to actually strengthen this process, to understand what does just JETP mean in the short term, in the long term, and in the medium term and long term. So maybe in the short term, it means shutting down inefficient power plants and coal mines that you will anyway close. And then, I mean, anyway, this 10 billion, 15 billion will be maybe barely useful for some of those power plants. So you don't need to have like a larger, coal phase out for the money that is being offered. So maybe in the short term, that's what it means. But I think that articulation, that understanding of the national, orientation or framework of what just transition means is really important. It's to kind of get to a stage where this JETP is meaningful. Otherwise, this JETP could be India's JETP could be about renewables. Like who knows, right? They can diverge completely from the original definition of just transition. So that's where we are at. I mean, this is an interesting year. I think as much as India will do its action at the G20 and galvanize its stand. It's also a great opportunity for India and Indian stakeholders to actually push this agenda forward. I mean, in 3 years, we have come this much. This is a very remarkable year where the other side, people who are from the G20 side, they have dealt with this just transition for decades. So it's an interesting phase where India can learn a lot. India can like actually start serious conversations about this topic. So I'll stop there, and reports like Pradeep's will be very useful. So I'll just stop there, but happy to chat more on this.
Thank you, Sandeep, for these points. In fact, I agree with you about how this whole thing is playing out in terms of the definition and how India can move forward. And your point about renewable also helps me segue to Vaibhav now. Vaibhav, do you see this specific point that Swati also mentioned, that how it will be defined in terms of renewable, whether JETP will only be can only be looked at, the one idea is that it can only be looked at from the very short term perspective of rapid shift to renewables, one of the things. Do you see that kind of focus, do you see that kind of push in terms of just transition taking shape only in terms of clean energy? Because we have repeatedly clarified that coal is going to stay for the time being. So in that context, do you see that happening, renewable energy becoming the main pillar of the just transition conversation, at least for the next some time?
Great. Thank you, Mayank and Climate Trends, for inviting me, and very happy to listen to all my colleagues in the panel. And congratulations to Pradeep. Very interesting report. I look forward to reading it and learning more from it. I'm not a political scientist, but I know that these are extremely important, research that is being done. So I look forward to learning from it. Now coming to Mayank, your particular question. So let me say, just building on what Swati and Sandeep have already said, just transition is JETP is about, G7 countries or maybe international partnerships coming together to aid a just transition process happening in any particular country, right? So that's like the partnership part. Just transition is extremely important. All of us know that conversation needs to happen. South Africa has done it in a very methodical way, which is great. But coming to the differentiating between the partnership and the just transition process itself, I would say my reading for the South African JETP, that it is like a neo IMF bailout, to put it very plainly, and maybe it's controversial, but that's what it is. So the whole just transition process is great within South Africa, but the partnership part, what G7 countries are offered, at the end of the day, it is always about the terms of the deal, right? What are the terms of the deal? That is where the whole devil lies, and the terms of the deal are very, very tight. Not enough money, but what are you asking for? Taking away coal. And that is why, because South Africa was in such a dire situation that it had to sign on to the deal. Right? And that is why I'm calling it a neo IMF bailout, because that's what it is. We will give you money, but the terms, we are going to govern the terms of it. And they're going to be very tight terms. And you will take the money only, if you are in such a need, such a desire kind of, situation, that you will accept the money, right? So that's what happened in South Africa. They have accepted the money. There is no commentator, no expert who is saying that this is not going to be a mess, compared to the need of the country and everything. And now they have gotten this another technical thing about phasing down coal, coming out of coal in a short time period and all that, right? So it is something challenging. To your question of whether renewable energy in India, what is like, is it going to be about renewable energy? I don't think we should, let's say, looking at the climate politics, we should differentiate between what would be the reality and how it is packaged, right? I think this differentiating is very important. The reality will be about coal. There's no doubt about it. Whatever and however it is packaged, like a clean energy transition and renewable energy transition, whichever smart way they find it out, it is going to be coal. Look at the other countries. They've gone for South Africa, they've gone for Indonesia. Both are coal-dependent economy. Why is the conversation happening with India? Because it's a coal-dependent economy. There are no two thoughts about it that from the donor perspective, it is about coal, right? That is the reason why they're choosing these countries and offering this partnership. And then let's say, I don't think India is in that situation. I think all of us agree. India is not in a situation that we will agree to the neo IMF bailout kind of package on the just transition. We are not in that situation. In all probability, we will not sign on to it, right? So what Sandeep said is very important. The conversation itself not mature, right? But if you are in financially in a very dire situation, what history has told us, you will sign on to the deal. Whether there has been a conversation or not a conversation, that will not matter. Your finances and economics will compel you to sign on to the deal, right? So right now, even though the conversation has not happened, the larger point is in terms of economic situation itself, We are not in that situation that we are compelled to sign on to the deal, right? But let's say, assuming that India does sign on to the deal, then of course it will be packaged very nicely, like it will be just, and it will be renewable energy, clean energy, job creation, economic growth, everything. But at the heart of it is going to be coal, right? And I think all of us understand this. The government understands this. Everybody understands it. So there's a reason this conversation is not going, anywhere. Yeah, and that's how I look at it. They have to think about a much better deal for India, so to speak. And even what that better deal is, I think India will determine the terms, because we are not in a situation like South Africa, and we'll sign on to anything that comes our way. Yeah. So let me just stop here. Happy to have continue this conversation.
Thank you, Vaibhav. Thank you so much. Professor Pradeep, before I come back to you, let me just put it on very black and white. I urge everyone attending here right now, journalists, researchers, to please carefully go through IIT Kanpur's this report, this one, and especially the other one that they are going to release soon, or they have already released, I think, which talks about the glossary, which talks about the basics of energy transition, basics of just transition. Because a lot of times when we are having this conversation, we come across a lot of people who are still confused about a lot of basic terms. And I was going through this report a couple of days ago, and it goes in quite detail about how different institutions, how different stakeholders are defined. I think that's very helpful for anybody working in this field. Professor Pradeep, now I'm just coming back to you, starting from your report, and then how Swati, Vaibhav, and Sandeep has added to the conversation. It comes back to how things are on the ground. And I was looking at one of the major points of your report, which talks about the lack of consensus, which talks about the coal downside, the environment part, the community part. Can you elaborate a little more and talk, tell us about the impact and the conversation within the mining affected communities? Even though we know that the G20 action is nowhere close to them, or they may not even have a say in the action that happening on the G20 level. But can we just elaborate a little more on that?
Yes, so that's why I just wanted to contextualize in the beginning, and most of the speakers today said it, and Vaibhav said it very straightforward, okay, so because a couple of days back, I was discussing with another group, whether it's a debt trap or something and that's why I pointed out, is it a renewable or something like that. But the idea of just transition developed, and as a concept, also it's a people-centric. I mean, IEA most of the time talks about people-centric. Many organizations talks about people-centric transition. Now, whether we are showing people in front of us to get money and do something else, or whether we are really concerned about the people and work together. We know that it is not possible only to design something from the bottom up. It's not possible to do something from the top and everything implement successfully. In the past, we don't have any experience. But the good thing about just transition discourse throughout the world and in India is that we have a good opportunity. Now, definitely there are politics, but that's not actually important, because we, as Sandeep mentioned, we have started doing in various phases and research, and particularly I'll say that epistemic community has an important role to play in just transition. And with new knowledge creation can be anything. It can be economic modeling system, dynamics modeling, decision support system. It can have an anthropological study. It can have a political analysis. It can have anything. But I think in the next few years, along with if we move from the second to third phase, we need a lot of information and data sets, which is not very macro level data set, we micro level data. I also, if we go through the NFI report, everybody praised it because we know something from that, but we have to know more. And that's why we think, because we are at humanities and social sciences, and we are planning to do all these things in the very grassroots level, going to the field, talking to the people, and just create a knowledge base again and again. We have more plans to do that, so that the next level of, I don't know who is going to read this report and take what kind of decision. I don't know how the Coal India or like Ministry of Coal or G20, when they are signing a deal, economic package, they will think about the grassroots. But the thing is that at least we should have something in our hand very carefully done, methodologically sound, not like very trivial information collecting from ABC and giving some detail, so that at some point, if people want, they can have some informed decision making. Because we are, the heart of this entire debate is justice. And as Sandeep also mentioned, procedural justice is there, but there are other components of justice and how people are taken into consideration. Who is doing for what? NTPC is investing on renewable, Coal India is doing something else apart from coal, and that's fine. That's, we are talking about one set of actors. And that is why I said that we have to understand international actors, we have to understand domestic actors, and the last level of the stakeholder who was there in the ground. And that is why, because we are showcasing the last level first and actually getting benefited some other group of people. So, I mean, that is fine. But the thing is that we should give more and more data and knowledge so that the system can take a more informed decision, or we can have some alternative voices. And that's why these three important things like collaborative decision making and their contested decision making, more debated decision making. I think that's a very important point, because if anyone wants to argue about the people or something happens in Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh or the Eastern Bloc and the Southern Bloc, something like that, renewable and coal, they need some data, they need some solid report. If there is a paper, suppose published in Nature Energy or something like that, people can cite that. So that is the role of top scale academic publication also in the decision making. And as many of our students are also working on the science and policy interface, I think this is very important, even if it's very, very high level policy making body or a platform which can take a decision. So this is briefly my comment. I'll happy to comment more about this.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Thank you for this elaborative answer. Uh, I have a couple of questions about the report, but I'll come back to it during the discussion. I wanted to now broad base this conversation and go on to how India left at COP and how India can actually, at the recently concluded COP, Indian government, Indian delegation pushed or was talking specifically about phase out of all fossil fuels. When we are moving to the G20 era, presidency era for the next 1 year, do you see a similar scene playing out? I know a couple of you have mentioned in the remarks, in the initial remarks, but I just wanted you to elaborate a little more. Any one of you, Swati, Vaibhav, Sandeep, any one of you wants to take it up and tell us a little more that do you think the similar scene playing out, that India talks about phasing out of all fossil fuels rather than only coal? Do you see that conversation in the G20 as well?
I think you should name who you want to speak first.
Sandeep, do you want to go first on that?
No, I mean, you should. Well, I'll keep it brief. I mean, it's a good question. I think at COP, so of course, last COP, India was criticized for its stand on, like changing from coal phase out to coal phase down, and it received considerable flack because the environment minister was the one who stood up and said those words. But I mean, look, we all know after that, this is not just India. This was like US plus China plus India, and all the coal majors came together to so-called water down the language. And so at this COP, there was again this fear that India could receive a similar pushback on its stand on coal and stuff. So India also kind of went ahead and said that why don't we phase out all fossil fuels, which is fair if you follow science-based models, or science-based meaning like to the degree there's a lot of criticisms about integrated assessment models or IPCC model, but regardless, look, any scenario where you want to meet 1.5 or 2-degree climate targets, you kind of have to phase out all fossil fuels. So India went with that stand because, I mean, for India, coal is the key to energy security, at least in the short and medium term. For US and other countries, it's oil and gas. Coal is no longer that energy security source. So it was in India's way of kind of, not just diverting attention, but also calling on common but differentiated responsibility that, look, stop talking about only coal, talk about all fossil fuels. And I mean, it got some support, you can say, from EU and the US. I mean, I don't know about US, like at least there were some stories about that US is also supporting, but at the end of the day, it did not pass. And, we now have even the low emission sources as part of the Egypt declaration. So that was at COP, and COP has a very different atmosphere where, everybody's calling for more and more ambitious, and the media is watching, the world NGOs are watching. But I don't think G20 is that kind of platform where everybody is watching and descending into like such kind of declaration. So I would be very surprised if India starts with a stand to phase out coal. I mean, you may hear, such calls once in a while, but I don't think it will be a very strong call as it was at COP.
Thank you, Sandeep. Swati?
I think, yes, I agree that to Sandeep's point that the atmosphere is different between COP and between G20. But what does the term phase out of all fossil fuel mean? Like, yes, there is phase out of coal, oil, gas, but at the same time, the only reason you can phase this out is because there is an acceleration in renewable energy technology, right? And what has India been saying all this time? When in the context of just transitions, India has actually been saying this. It, without mentioning coal, it is still saying that it wants to accelerate deployment of renewable energy. It needs support in accelerating renewable energy technology. The unsaid part of it is that it is going to that the coal usage may come down, or rather, the coal usage will come down. But given the political economy of coal in the country, we don't really mention that. So while we may not hear this exact phrase saying, oh, phase out of all fossil fuels, we may see conversations that sort of circle around this phrase. And if we, in the context of Jet P, if we are thinking of a Jet P, it's going to include both RE and coal in its way. While coal may not be explicitly mentioned in an Indian Jet P, RE will probably take the center stage in the form of green jobs, in all of this. So we're still going down, we're still using the, we may not use the terminology, but we're still we're still accepting what it means without actually spelling it out. And I think given all conversations that we've had over the last several years, including the Glasgow conversation, I think that this is quite a lot of improvement in the Indian stance. And the phase out of all fossil fuels, by the way, was not just here, even last year. During the negotiations, what went in the final text was different, but even during the negotiations, India consistently spoke about phasing out of all fossil fuels. And we've stuck to that stance. Whether we will say it in G20 in that exact same phrase, I don't think so, because it's not the same platform as COP. But the spirit of it we will look at the spirit of it when we are talking about clean technologies and acceleration of clean technologies, green jobs, etc.
Thank you, Swati, for that. Okay, let's look at this conversation like this. When we are talking about G20, when we're talking about COP, we talk about G7, how this whole conversation is playing out. One of the important part that repeatedly comes out is, where is the money? Where is the finance? Especially for a country like India, because it is very clear that when we talk about accelerated transition, we talk about significant investment, we need it for both mitigation and adaptation, while keeping the development priorities intact, especially an economy like India in mind. First part, do we see that finance flowing? Do we see those instruments? And second, India has also talked about asking the developed world's contribution to the resilience and the response to JT. Do you see this finance and this developed world's contribution as the major focus area in the next couple of years, or at least for the next 1 year specifically? Vaibhav, I'll start with you on this.
Yeah, so finance is always going to be a very important part of the discourse. And in fact, of course, it is going to be linked to many things. The first big question is how do we even define finance? And that is also the definite, I mean, in the sense, there's no agreement on it, right? So that is the first, starting point to agree on the definition of all of this. What does finance constitute, and what are the channels of finance? But we know that it is one of the most important things for the global South, because this is where the growth is, and this is where finance becomes a bottleneck. So in fact, I think one of the speeches of the environment minister, this COP also framed finance as a barrier, which is very interesting. Right. So the whole text said that it said barrier, and then it said finance is a barrier. Lack of finance, like lack of low cost finance is a barrier, something like that. That is very important. To highlight it up in front that we are not just talking about growth and that it is an exciting story. So please come and give us finance. No, it is a barrier for a clean transition and towards decarbonization. And yes, there are many sources. I think there's some agreement has to happen on what does constitute finance. I think the bottom line, what all of us do understand is that majority of it is going to be private finance, right? We can't expect public financial sources to, especially on the mitigation part. See, I mean, climate impacts and loss and damage is a very different story. Maybe there is no play for the private sector there. So that's very much more complicated. But at least on the mitigation part, with the expectation is a lot of it will be private finance. Public finance should be used to leverage private finance. So that is the role of public finance. Which means you maybe interest rate subsidies on some risk covers, those kinds of things that need to be used to incentivize flow of finance from the global north to the global south. Now, whether it will be counted as climate finance is another thing there, because the India will always say this is private finance, this is not climate finance, right? But for transition, I mean, going away from the politics of it, from the transition perspective, this private finance will play much more, I mean, extremely important, if not much more, but extremely important role for the transition process. And of course, the impact debate, the loss and damage debates are very different debates altogether. The loss and damage, the finance of it is actually a bottomless pit. And all of us do know that, one event in one country costs like millions of dollars. And one event in one country in 1 year. And this loss and damage is going to non-linearly increase. We are only sitting at 1.1 degrees. At 1.5 degrees, it is going to increase non-linearly. So the ask will be, unimaginably huge. And that is the whole worry of the developed world. That's why in this COP, this whole conversation about major economies. So they were saying simply, we can't foot the bill. China and India have to step in. And any economy that starts becoming a major economy has to join the bandwagon to finance, right? And of course, it is a kind of a very interesting googly for many of the developing world negotiators, right? That suddenly we wanted us to be recipient. Suddenly the frame is changed. We are asked to be a donor now, right? So very different framing. So all this will happen. And I don't think in loss and damage, we are a very long way to go, because the developed world will not agree, because this is a bottomless pit. So let us at least focus on getting the mitigation story right, because their chances of getting finance are very real. We have to just get that right first and continue the conversation on impacts and loss and damage, because that is also very important. But let's definitely focus on getting the financial mitigation, which looks much more possible, and not through the JET-P route. I mean, if these are the terms, the other routes, because we are also, JET-P is only one of the routes of finance. There will be other routes. So let's focus on other routes that don't have all of these, very hard terms and conditions attached to them. But we should definitely focus on those alternative channels.
Thank you, Vaibhav. Very interesting point. Swati, I want just you to step in, and because you are in a very interesting position, you are looking at it from a very international perspective as well. Can you add on? Can you just weigh in here about the finance part and how the developed world's contribution to the resilience to the resilience part? Can you just weigh in here?
So I look at JET-P as a mitigation plus adaptation fund. The mitigation part of it is accelerating renewable energy deployment. The adaptation part of it is looking at green jobs, at reskilling, at economic diversification, at creating supply chains, at bridging the fiscal gap that local governments are going to see in their revenue, and therefore deployment in social sector schemes. So it's a combination of two. I agree with Weber. We should look at other sources for mitigation-led finance. because I think that it's easier and the conditions may not be as intrusive as a JETP deal when we're talking about mitigation-led finance. But at the same time, I don't see private finance or even government stepping in to provide money on adaptation. Despite the conversation on loss and damage. Loss and damage is a completely different context to the larger conversation that we're having around just transitions. And I don't see private finance stepping in. I don't see private companies stepping in until we have public finance that sort of eases the root and eases the risk, lowers the risk of in some of these areas. Which is why I think that when we think of finance, of climate finance, JETP, any other bilateral agreement. Somebody mentioned the partnership in the chat on Indo-German partnership on clean energy. All of these are different ways to look at climate finance, but their end use or their end goal needs to be clearly defined within the domestic conversation, because it's easier for a company or any government to invest in mitigation-led activities because you can actually see returns. What will be the returns of investing in employment or reskilling? How do you quantify those returns? Because at the end of the day, investors want to see how can these returns be quantified and what is the return that they can see on their books? How do you quantify that? So, which is why I think while the sources of funding can be A, B, C, D, where this funding can be used in India needs to have a broader and a much deeper discussion.
Thank you, Swati. It's actually, money is always a difficult task, how it is coming and where it is coming from. So I think there are no easy answers to this conversation about finance. But let's take this forward. Both of you mentioned about the global South cooperation and how developing world is reacting to a lot of this conversation. Pradeep, I wanted to ask you that during the G20 presidency, or say in the next couple of years, do you see India trying to champion India has always tried to do that, but do you see more power to the voice of emerging countries during India's G20 presidency in the agenda? Do you see that becoming central to the conversation or the decision-making process, especially in the next 1 year?
Yeah, I think it's a very good opportunity. When you host anything, you have certain advantage as a host. So it's a sports or it's an economic activity or anything. Like in IIT, we host inter-IIT, we get little amount of extra prizes as a host sometimes. But apart from that, if we look let's see from Copenhagen, let's start from Copenhagen to Paris and various in-between things, and how the position of India actually, I will not say changed, but varies in time to time. And you can understand India sometimes is a very good negotiator, and in the last few years, and when they are talking and they are very clear about this voice, I mean, it's very important to raise certain issues like a point like 2070. It can be debated like whether it's good, bad, and all these things, but giving a target specific, not diluting things in abstract. So those were those Copenhagen days, like who will bail the cat first, and then failure and all these things. And then a lot of technology discussion, CDM. So technology will solve the problem. So you don't have to worry about fossil fuel. Then the Paris event, and then now when you're talking about phasing out coal, well, now the coal is in the forefront, and that's why this discussion of the G20. And I hope, like the way India is planning, definitely India will have certain advantage. And also, if you link it to this International Solar Alliance, 500 gigawatt targets, all these are very specific. And this is, I think, India is very strong in terms of like policy targets. Now, you can debate whether we can achieve this target, 50 gigawatts per year from now, this and that, and 175, it's not fulfilled and all these things. But setting some targets clearly in front of the world, not, I mean, if you look at the negotiator from the small island, or like China, or like United States, I think India is now becoming more mature in terms of international platform. And when we are hosting here at India in G20, I'm expecting that more matured and India favored decision is going to come in terms of energy transition. Now, whether just or not just, that's a different thing, but important thing in the energy transition is expected. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Sandeep, I want to ask you, we have in the last few months, we have seen so much happening on the energy crisis. We have seen so many conversations on this. We saw countries scrambling, trying to reopen some coal plants. This conversation or this debate between energy security and energy transition, do you see that taking center stage during the G20 presidency? Because we saw that happening during the last few months.
That's an interesting question. Let me try to speculate whether that will take center stage or not. I mean, I think the short answer is yes, but it might be more subtle than the way you are seeing it now. I mean, one thing I have realized, first being a reporter and then being a researcher, each country is on their own, right? To each their own, they say, right? Like nobody's gonna do an energy transition because it's 1.5 degree. I mean, we can say all that, like everybody tries to claim climate leadership, every country, but every country is first concerned about its energy security. I think energy security is sort of a must. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Europe now or in the US, US has passed these really ambitious Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act and massive, like really solid energy transition act. But at the same time, they're also expanding oil and gas production. They want to become the new LNG, powerhouse of the world. They've already almost they're supplying. So I think the point that I'm trying to make is that energy security will always be at the forefront of any country's agenda because it impacts people immediately and in the short term, and that responds to the political economy. So that's the same case with India. Is why we are all talking about coal, and why India is reluctant. I mean, I'm not saying India should not be, but why is reluctant? Because of energy security concerns. So given that every country thinks about its energy security and then energy transition and climate change, I think that this conversation will spill out in the open. It's a long year in India's G20 presidency, but I don't see that as like a major theme that will be discussed at the G20 itself. I mean, it may come out in some other way or form in terms of collaborations and partnerships, but I'm not sure like if that would be like a debate at the G20. At next COP, sure. I mean, this is really a COP topic, climate change and energy security and what any country wants to sign on to and stuff like that. I don't think I gave a convincing answer, but that's how I would think about this.
No worries, no worries. Therefore, I want to ask you one simple, very clear-cut question. Do you think there is a big ticket announcement or any alliances in the works during the next 1 year? We already have some indications about the ministers talking about a biofuel alliance on lines of ISA. Do you see that happening?
Yeah. So anything that is not to do with coal, I think definitely there could be a big announcement. See, I mean, ultimately G20, all the announcements we have to be like everybody should be happy. That is the kind of announcement. A positive announcement shows ambition, makes everybody happy, no controversy. See, this question about whether we'll have even fossil phase out, right? I mean, Saudi Arabia is a part of G20. How are we going to have a fossil phase out wording there? It's not possible at all, right?
Yeah.
So, of course, these are, yeah. So anything positive, biofuel looks good. I think life looks good. Life, everybody is, and Indian government has made it a very strong pillar in this COP also. And it is a very important thing. I mean, the whole consumption-based discourse, which everybody has been neglecting for so long, it is an extremely important lever from the climate action perspective also. And it is one of the levers that it makes everybody happy. I mean, in the sense, there's no big controversies around it. Everybody will say yes to it kind of thing. So life is something that the government is definitely focusing a lot. So we could see something on life, but something like biofuel also is a very positive story. So any of those things can be very well be a part of the G20, and definitely the government of India wants to showcase it as like they have delivered something for the global humanity, and one earth, one family. A narrative is already being proposed, so that is they are going to follow up on that. Yeah.
No, I agree. Everybody is happy talking about it. Whether it comes into practice is another question, because what happens to the wood pellets in Europe, or say the big trucks in the West? But that's not a question for today. Swati, do you want to just add on quickly to this alliance part?
Yeah, no, I think we should. I think something on critical minerals will be interesting, right, from an Indian government perspective, because a lot of our new technologies are going to be reliant on this. And right now, China is more or less the leader in critical minerals. And I think from a geopolitical perspective also, it'll be interesting to see how India maneuvers the conversation around critical minerals in the G20, given that there's already an alliance happening between the US, Europe, Canada, and we're not part of that alliance despite Quad and everything else that we have a multilateral platform. So I think life and possibly something on critical minerals, because that will also help align some of our state-owned enterprises and their plans.
Thank you, Swati. I have one more question to ask to Pradeep before we open it for questions from the audience. We already have a couple. Pradeep, I was going through the report and your report, and it is talking also about environment protection, which is specifically when we talk about energy transition, a lot of times environment protection or questions about environment is missing from the conversation. Can you elaborate a little more on that before we open to audience? They already have questions for our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. So there's a old debate, like couple of sentences. There's a old debate between development and environment contestation. And then a group of people, there are environmentalism and thinking about environment, and then the sustainable development, like our future generation should be secured. And then we should be secured, environment should be secured, our future generation should be secured. This kind of transition is going on. And as I mentioned earlier, like things are not easy, policy processes are not easy, because there are contestation, conflict of interest in some respect. So first we have to think of ourselves as an individual, as a group, as a community, and then we are thinking of some other group of people. And we are expecting like the government should take action, the company should take action, all these things. So we have certain expectation. And that's why environmental protection is there, because sometimes all these things are kind of a moral and ethical. We are doing something good because we are thinking for future. But all this discussion, like the G20, as we are discussing, is that what I have written some time back is like, sometimes it's easy to decouple science and politics and talk more about science and nice things about life, that India is like a nice, like coexisting with nature and starting our INDC with some Sanskrit sloka and something like that. So nobody is going to debate on that, and that is nice. And consumption level, my point is that life, and I am part of this life core committee, is that how you are going to measure it, this kind of what is going to, we are taking a decision through project. We need that kind of mechanisms also. Like if we are taking some policy decision, we should measure its effectiveness and what kind of output we are getting. Sometimes economic decisions also we get some of the outputs, but nothing is kind of a very clear cut. And when environment sometimes coming as a moral and ethical things, and we have to think of, this concept is coming with always environment, but also we have to think about ourselves. So that kind of contestation is there, and whole debate is there, because we are like globally we are thinking about environment and also sometimes the individual. So that is there, but there are a lot of debates, so we don't have time for today, but this is an important perspective and it is all related. That's my point. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you so much, Pradeep. Okay, we have 20 minutes. We'll quickly take, there are 4 questions from audience. We'll quickly take those questions and then we move to the closing remarks. There's a question from Shweta, which she's asking, in May this year, the PMO and German government bilateral reached a 10 billion commitment under Green and Sustainable Development Partnership with focus on clean energy. Is there a need to streamline or look at negotiation on clean energy or JETP linked to NDC, where low carbon transition impacts extends beyond coal? Swati, I will you like to take this up, please?
The quick and short answer is we don't know. We don't know. And the reason for this is because in the last 2 years, I think there have been too many moving parts and moving goalposts that have been happening. There are multiple different negotiations that are happening at different levels. The larger the end goal of all of these discussions is to help India phase out or phase down unabated coal. But there isn't enough coordination. Now, Germany also held the G7 presidency this year. And US and Germany are also the 2 leading negotiators on the JETP discussions in India. So a lot of this is happening in parallel wavelengths. Yes, we should sort of link the discussions to each other, but it honestly depends on the perspective of the Indian government, because each of these agencies are also negotiating with different people within the government.
Okay, I think that answers partly Shweta's question, but thank you so much, Swati, on that. There's a question from Shruti Sharma. She's asking, we saw explicit language on JT at COP27. This was the first. What kind of language on JETP would you expect in the G20 community? I think we have answered a part of it, but if somebody just wants to, like Weber, would you want to take a quick stab at it?
I won't hazard a guess on this one, but we know it is going to be a positive language, in JTP. Yeah, I mean, nothing more to, add. The usual things will be there. I think COP language could be very similar to the COP language, what we have seen at COP. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much.
Can I say one
Yes,
thing?
please,
That
please,
I
please.
still don't understand what the COP language is on just transition. To be very clear, I have said the day I read that, and I also heard Indian ministers, speech. I was just like, what does it even mean? Like, what does it mean? Are we talking about just transition worker, or this is like some other, just transition completely different? So I don't know what that is. So to Vaibhav's point, something similar, which basically means nothing in real terms,
Yeah.
but the language is amazing. You could see at G20.
Yeah, there's one thing we know, right? It makes everybody happy and nobody uncomfortable, right? That's what we know, and that's the reason why that kind of language is there. So something similar might be there in G20, right?
I think we can leave that at work in progress kind of board, with work in progress kind of board. Okay, Kavya has a question. Kavya Singhal, she is saying, do we have a sense of priorities for India at Clean Energy Ministerial next year, as both Clean Energy Ministerial and G20 presidency will see an overlap? What will be the agendas which India should push for Clean Energy Ministerial and G20? Pradeep, will start with you, and then I'll ask Swati to weigh in.
I don't know. Like the last time, it was my first meeting with the Clean Energy Ministerial in the Pittsburgh, and I was like a observer and looking what people are doing, how they are talking, and all these things. And I think in this particular thing, like clean energy, Ministry of Coal or coal related things are not actually taken very positively. So that is another important thing. So we should talk, people talk more about renewable technology, different kind of innovations and all this, and various kind of partnership, just to strengthen the infrastructure of renewables. And that's very happy positive thing and kind of an ambitious thing. but nobody was talking about how this coal phase out is going to happen. We did, I mean, Sandeep spearheaded that kind of talk. But I think along with the G20 and CEM, there again, there will be both, as Vaibhav is saying, very kind of positive thing like, okay, technology is the solution maker. So we will focus more, okay, we are very good at technology, India or globally, we have certain innovation going on. We are going to solve this problem, even if we don't know what XYZ technology, for example, hydrogen or something like that, but we are expecting that, okay, this kind of technology is going to solve this problem. So kind of a confidence to the mass, like, okay, don't worry, we are here and we'll take care of this problem. And that is the very positive language in a kind of a message term is there, or generally there, generally on CEM or this G20 kind of things. It is not, I mean, in COP, we see a lot of even contestation. There is a non-state actor groups and side event, whatever it is, like there might be a debate whether that contestation have a different perspective or not. But this kind of economic and this ministerial meeting, they are very straightforward and they are deal makers sometimes. So that's my very brief point.
Thank you, Pradeep. Swati?
I think we will see overlapping agendas at both, because if you see India's G20 priorities, technology is clean energy technology is one of the priority areas. Just transitions is another priority area. The behavioral change is another priority area. So, and if you look at the SEM agenda, typically breaking grounds on new technology is the SEM agenda. Over the last year, they've also have a new initiative called Empowering People Initiative, which speaks about which speaks to the issues related to energy transitions in the country. So yes, there will be overlaps in terms of themes. The outcomes may be different because the countries participating in SEM and the countries participating in the G20 don't always overlap. So we may see a difference in the outcome, but the agenda more or less has a lot of similarities between the two. The Indian stands on both at both SEM as well as G20. The Indian stance at SEM especially has been very progressive. It is spearheaded by, for those who don't know, by the Ministry of Power, the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, Science and Technology, DST, Department of Science and Technology, and they've always been very outspoken about the need to enhance technological advancement in India, to speak on technology transfer, to look at subsidizing some of the technologies in different areas. And this is not limited to just electricity generation, which mostly covers the JETP conversation, but it's also related to going beyond electricity into transport, into shipping, into cement. It's a whole wide-ranging conversation. So some of it will obviously feature in G20, others may not feature in G20.
Thank you, Swati. Vaibhav?
Yeah. So I think the politics of conversations at COP and G20 are much more tricky than the politics of conversations at the Clean Energy Ministry. So and that's what determines kind of many things. And that is why the agenda of CEM is very clear. I think there's a broad agreement among partners also. And that's why when we see progress, we see a lot more progress at these kind of dedicated platforms compared to COPs and G20, which have nice languages and all. And in fact, at CEM also, there is I think last time they decided on some demonstration projects also, and I think a long list of demonstration projects, right? Now, this is actual progress. The moment you show these kinds of things, and then many actors start learning from these, and that's how actual progress happens. So those kinds of very kind of positive developments we do expect to happen at SEM, definitely. And one overlapping agenda is clearly finance. So SEM also talked about low-cost finance, so pushing the energy transition agenda. In fact, I think the G20 communique, even the energy section, I think we started with saying that something like an economic recovery is a priority, something like that, which is very interesting. So basically, in a way, it identifies and highlights that even for the energy transition conversation and agenda, the larger backdrop of economic recovery is extremely important. It recognizes that, which is true. It is extremely important. And so it will always play in the background of G20. You know, this year we know that the expectation many countries are going through recession, right? Of course, India's growth rates have already been revised downwards, right? Even though we are probably the highest growing economy, growth rates have been revised downwards, right? So this is going to be the larger backdrop of G20, right? Of course, energy is going to be a very important part, but the larger backdrop is very different. How sustainable economic recovery is probably going to be the thrust, right? Whereas CEM is going to be front and center about clean energy and how do we demonstrate many things to move the markets, right? So the agendas, even though they're overlapped, they're clearly very different agendas altogether.
Thank you,
Can I
Vaibhav.
add
Thank you for
just
making that point. Yes, please.
one or two lines on this? So, I mean, my experience attending SEM this year in Pittsburgh, along with Swati and Pradeep, was that it's also a very interesting event where lots of companies and countries and subnational actors actually meet. So when you attend SEM, you see all these different kinds of EVs and electric trucks, and so all these companies displaying their products and stuff. So it's really an interesting platform, devoid of as much politics as say a COP or a G20, where actually the actors who would implement kind of meet each other and talk about and get introduced. And of course that's the starting of the conversation. And then if say a subnational state in India and a US company is interested and they have their priorities match, this SEM provides that kind of platform for them to meet and kind of explore future collaborations. So that I think we should treat SEM in that way. It's a little bit less political compared to the G20 and the COP. I would rank it as COP and then G20 and then SEM in that order of politics.
Mine, just one line. I think
Sure.
if we are hosting SEM, so I think it's a good opportunity. Like we have a program called Auto Innovation Mission. So and the IITs and CSIR and DST, they are doing a lot of good work. And think this is a platform like, for example, battery, because we are very lithium dependent battery for solar and China and all these things. And I think recent publication is also experimenting on the sodium and then how that can actually India can be lead in that. So if we can demonstrate some of the things, and I have seen like a lot of nice demonstration in the last SEM, and if we can demonstrate some of our major findings or innovations related to clean energy, I think that will be very good opportunity and they'll also get some market. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradeep. Sandeep, I have last question from the audience before we just close the session. There's a question from Manoj Mahata. He's asking, energy being a concurrent subject, how differently states can or should play a complementary role to support India at the national level, as well as have a clear state roadmap or state transition in terms of air?
Did you ask me?
Yes, Sandeep.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's a really important and interesting question, right? So this government of India and this is not just an India story. I think this is a story of any country that has, states and it's relatively democratic. Um, so you have national government who attends all these G20s and or hosts G20 or goes to COP, and perhaps that plus from domestic intent raises its ambition. But to what degree that kind of ambition percolates into states is like a really important question. And I think each state a cluster of states would be very different. So states in the west and the south may respond differently. They are ahead of the curve. States which are in eastern India may respond very differently because they're slow. Their governance mechanisms are not as uh, sort of catalytic as the other states. But I think, I mean, one of the things that always, I host this podcast, but a lot of guests come and talk about is is how do you make, you know, the federal government and the states align? So one thing that I always wonder is, when we set all these NDCs, are states consulted, and not just consulted on paper, but are they truly consulted? Has these large targets been broken down into like state specific targets and stuff? So it's an important question. Uh, I don't think it's happening to the degree that it should happen, but I think to do meaningful mitigation and adaptation in the long run, where Webhub's numbers show that we need so much of solar and so much of wind, uh, you got to have states on board. Otherwise, that net zero target would be so difficult, especially when all those land issues and various other transmission issues start to come up. So I'll stop there, but I think it's an important question.
Yeah.
India needs an integrated policy where states, but also every ministry, should talk to each other about what the policy and the outcome is.
Thank you so much, Sandeep. We just have time for quick closing remarks. I'll give you, like, I want everyone to just give me one closure line, that what is one thing you wish from India's G20 presidency year in terms of energy transition? I'll start with Vaibhav, Swati, Pradeep, and Sandeep.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, I mean, it will be, as I said, kind of very nice language, and I don't expect any different messaging coming out. Messaging perspective, I think it is a heavy agenda of G20 is going to be macroeconomics, and then every section will be subsumed within that larger perspective. And I do see, I think, finance is going to be again reiterated, just transition is going to be reiterated in that clearly, and life is going to be reiterated. Those three things are clearly going to be a part of it. But as I said, I mean, G20 communique are also, these are kind of high-level policy signals. The question always is, what are markets taking? Like, what is the takeaway for markets from these signals? Now, if it is, let's say, a fossil phase out, then it is a really new information for the markets, right? Especially from oil and gas producers' perspective. So that is new, right? But very few times these kind of new things come out from these communiques. And I don't expect, I mean, life is something very interesting. Those kinds of things will be there. But the question is, what will markets take away? And that is still, I mean, only we will see what the markets will take away from this G20 presidency. But it is going to be a very important event for defining shape of many things to come, in that, from that perspective, the longer term agenda, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Vaibhav. Swati?
I think any strong language or communication on JTP is going to be a surprise. From in terms of it, I don't honestly see us reaching an agreement, but I do see us having some form of a mention. I do see a lot of emphasis and focus on climate finance and energy transition finance, more importantly, and how to enable that. I see a focus on on energy security, but not from a phase out or a phase down perspective, but more from a how do we acquire new technologies and meet our development goals of energy access, affordability in that context. So that's how I see the energy security discussion going. So these, I think, are the three key points that I see from next year.
Thank you, Swati. Pradeep, quick take.
I think this is an interesting platform, and we can get a lot of, apart from this is a government negotiation, we can get a lot of information about the market. And because we cannot deny any kind of a just transition or any this kind of track, ignoring market, because they have a very, very important role to play. So if we can closely observe like how the world market or the business group is thinking about all these important events, I mean, whatever it is, and then domestically after that, even subnational level or national level, we plan something like Jharkhand action plan for GT. So that kind of platform will help us to understand and prepare for a long-term plan. I think that is an important, G20 will be important event where we'll get a lot of market information very closely. I mean, definitely we are getting from international events, but when it is happening here, we are going to get that. That's my take.
Thank you, Pradeep. Sandeep?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to be the last person after you've heard everybody else say all the things you want to say. I had 3 points, each of them took away one each. So let me try to say something. I mean, so I think one thing that would distinguish this G20, to my mind, I'm trying to raise India's ambition here, is if we have more details. Like, we don't want another communique. There's been so many communiques, right? Like, that's why all these JETP announcement, even with Indonesia, I was like so disappointed that like there's no detail of like how the money will be there, what it will be used for, like what project. I mean, so I wish my wish list is that uh, while the broader communique could be, like very macro and kind of provide signals to the market or otherwise, I hope that there are some partnerships over the course of 1 year or deals that come up with more details. And I think that is where I would be watching if India can raise that ambition and make some of these partnerships more transparent, more accessible, uh, and more meaningful for climate workers or you or anybody else, for them for whom these partnerships are meant for.
Thank you, Sandeep. There was another question for CB. I have missed that. CB, I'm so sorry. We are running out of time. I can get this. I can ask the panelists to send a question, send answers to this question. Sorry, we're running out of time. Thank you so much to all the panelists. I think this sets the stage as we are entering this G20 presidency year. I think this sets the stage for conversation. This is not going to be the last conversation. We are going to have a series of workshops and conversations around this. Thank you so much for sharing your work, sharing your insights, and thank you, Professor Pradeep, for the report. I think it's a very interesting piece of work, and it can benefit a lot of people working in this space. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day, and Sandeep, have a great night.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you
you
all.
all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.